Welcome to the next episode of the Leadership Lab, where I'm delighted to say that I am joined by Dr. Michael Spence, President and Provost of University College London. Welcome.
Thank you.
We talk a lot with our scholars about leadership being a journey, not a destination. Can you talk a little bit about where it all began for you?
Yeah, so I suppose my leadership journey has certainly been something that evolved, but also I suppose something that draws on all sorts of experiences in your life in one way or another. Right? So the other day I was asked about the thing that I learned that was most useful in leadership, and the experience to which I referred then was that of being a waiter while I was at university and high school in a 24-hour restaurant. And we had the practice that we'd go into the kitchen and we would grab any name badge that there was there, not necessarily a name badge that said, hi, my name's Michael, but one that might say, hi, my name's Neil or Alan or whatever it might be. And that was terrific because at 4 o'clock in the morning, when some drunk person was abusing you and going, listen, Alan, you could say to yourself, he's not abusing me. He's abusing some person that he thinks of as a kind of dumb waiter, whose name is Alan. I'm Michael and he knows nothing about me. And it taught you to put a distance between your role, between the role and your personal identity, and to think about the way in which you navigate that distance. And of course, in a leadership role, in a job like being president of a university, people are sometimes angry with the president or the provost or whatever that might be. And it's important that you are authentic in your role as president and provost, but also important that you don't let it get to you, that you remember that it's a role, that you remember that it's a job. So on that journey, I think you're learning all the time and learning in all sorts of unexpected ways from all sorts of places. Who would have known that a job that I did to keep body and soul together as a student would have been great preparation for being a university president?
I love that. And actually, I was interviewing Larry Kramer, the Vice-Chancellor at LSE earlier this week, and he was talking about that lesson of it's not about you. And that if you, as a leader, take all of the feedback, the criticism, personally, you make it about you rather than about the role, and understanding early the difference between the role and what needs to be done by the role and for the role is really critical.
So one of the funny things about these jobs is that in some way, of course, you embody the institution for people. And therefore, you're often getting credit for things that you had nothing to do with, and also being blamed for things that you had nothing to do with. And you've got to take the good with the bad.
Yeah.
And that's just a part of the gig. But it is a gig. And I think Larry is exactly right, that when you take yourself too seriously in the role, or when you allow it too deeply to impact on your sense of self, then I think you're in trouble.
So he, like you, is sort of an implant into London. You were at University of Sydney for over a decade.
Yes.
What was it like moving to London?
Well, we moved to London in the middle of the pandemic, so that had its own peculiarities. In some ways it was extremely efficient because it meant you could meet a lot of people. You could be on Zoom at 9, 10, 11, 12. And there's a funny sort of intimacy to Zoom because rather than meeting 40 people in a drafty hall, they'd be looking into your spare room and meeting your kids and all the rest of it. So in that sense, it was good. It also taught me something, incidentally, about the social construction of authority, because I arrived in London in the middle of the pandemic, had all these Zoom meetings with people at the university. Then when I saw them in the flesh, they all said, "Oh, I thought you'd be taller." So I know now if you're president, you're supposed to be tall.
Sally Mapstone at St Andrews said exactly the same thing.
Well, there you go. It's good to know that it's gender neutral. But I think the move to London has been fabulous for me and my family. We've enjoyed it very much. UCL and Sydney are similar institutions in that they're large, comprehensive, research intensive, both founded as a part of the great 19th century secular education movement, both very early to admit women, both committed to useful knowledge. So it's not been as unexpected a transition as it might have been.
You knew Oxford as well, didn't
Yes.
you? Very well. And that, of course, has a very deep-seated history and a brand reputation. Is that different in any way from the other two?
So I think Oxford and Sydney are in that way different to UCL. I remember a friend of mine saying, I'm really sorry for you, Michael. And I said, why? And he said, because what on earth can you possibly do at work? I was reading the other day, says this chap in the paper, an article that started off, at the University of Sydney, Australia's premier university. He said, where do you take Australia's premier university? And both Oxford and Sydney have a sense of themselves as a kind of destination. And that can lead to a certain sort of complacency. UCL is a 200-year-old challenger brand. We've got a chip on our shoulder that we're not Oxford and Cambridge. And that leads to a relentless desire to do better in a place like this, and a real hunger to be excellent, and a real suspicion of complacency that I think is a distinctive UCL thing that we're that I'm very proud of.
So when you were at University of Sydney, you launched that phenomenal Inspired campaign and managed to raise $1 billion Australian dollars.
Yes.
Was that partly what motivated you to do it, this idea of, well, what can you possibly do now?
So that was a part of a move to take the university out and to get it more involved with the community, and the community more involved in the university in all sorts of ways. People often misunderstand university fundraising. They think of it as a particular kind of, begging for cash. Whereas, and of course, if it's that, it's never going to be successful, because, deciding between giving to feed poor children in the majority world or a Western university, why would you give to a Western university? What you do is you invest in a particular passion you have. You want to cure cancer. You want to see young people educated. You want to unlock the mystery of ancient Egypt. And the university comes along and says, well, you have this passion and usually this expertise and certainly this interest, and we can help you realize that. And so fundraising, when it's, philanthropy when it's at its best, is a real kind of partnership between someone who really cares about the issue and the university. And that also gives researchers and teachers a tremendous fillip, right? Because research in particular can sometimes be a lonely affair, being in the lab late at night by yourself. But if somebody really believes, who knows a lot about the area, really believes in what you do and believes in what you do enough to put their hand in their pocket, that can be tremendously inspiring for the people inside the university, just as their work can be inspiring for the people who are supporting it.
Do you have similar plans for such a large campaign at UCL?
We do. We are in the early phases, in the preparatory phases for a significant campaign here at UCL. The UCL story is just a tremendous one, and we're very keen to get people involved.
You and I obviously met because we have scholars at UCL, and I am always blown away by just how high the number of applicants are for the scholarship. So of all of our 19 university partners, UCL always tops the list. Now, clearly, you have a great team who do a wonderful job marketing it. But do you think there's something else in the makeup of UCL students, maybe because they are part of this high energy challenger brand, that makes them want to do more and even to be more?
Yeah, so I think there is something about the sorts of students that are attracted to London, and UCL really has the DNA of London, and I suppose in two ways. Of course, and UCL was founded on two principal commitments. The first was that to go to Oxford or Cambridge at the time, you had to sign the 39 Articles of the Church of England. So the notion was that to live together well in community, you all had to think the same thing. UCL was founded on the then very radical notion that you could think quite different things and yet live together well in community. And part of what we have been doing over 200 years, but we're particularly focusing on at the moment, is what that means, how you really curate for pluralism, how you make sure there is genuine diversity in the community of a kind that reflects the diversity of the city. And then, if there is diversity, there's going to be disagreement, how you disagree well across difference. Not disagree agreeably, not as if every conversation were a polite Hampstead post-dinner party chatter. Things where your amygdala, as much as your frontal lobe cortex, are involved. Things about which people are passionate that touch on identity, but nevertheless disagree constructively. So that's the first foundational commitment, this commitment to diversity and to seeing quite different ideas rub up against one another creatively in the way they do in the City of London. The other foundational commitment was I was 20 years at Oxford and loved the place, but our founders were rather sneering about what they called the polite learning of Oxford and Cambridge and said that they wanted to found a place of useful knowledge. Now, that doesn't mean that all the research and teaching we do is in the translational area. So much of our work is really very fundamental, but it does mean that there's an ethos here of genuinely wanting to solve problems and to see the world be a better place. And I think that combination of a commitment to engaging with the diverse community and thinking about what leadership in that environment means, and a commitment to seeing change for the good, which is a very characteristic ragamuffin sort of London spirit, attracts a particular kind of student. And that, happily, is the sort of student for whom a program like the Laidlaw program is very attractive.
Yeah, it's an exact match, isn't it? Because we've got the research element, which is all about trying to understand the causes of things, not to have a pre-packaged or even performative answer.
Yes.
And then we have the leadership experience part.
And of course, the global part too. The Laidlaw Scholars have an international experience. We pride ourselves on being London's global university and all the rest of it. And it's hard not to be global in London, right? Because all the world meets here.
Yeah, I mean, the international component, whether it's for the research summer or the leadership summer, we think is so important. I am often struck that we have a different view of our own country when we're looking at it from somebody else's country. Have you experienced that at all? And I suppose specifically, now that you're in Europe, do you think there are things that people in Europe miss about the Western Pacific that, if you're there, seems so obvious to you?
Yes. So to answer the first question, in a sense, it's been the story of my adult life. So I was married to an American who I met in Oxford, and she passed away in 2012, and I remarried in 2015, and my current wife is Korean, and she fell pregnant unexpectedly on our honeymoon, and then we thought he needed a little friend, and so we had another one, and then another one came 5 years ago. We know not where from. So we have these 8 children and 23 passports between 23? Us as a family, because the older children will have 3, the younger children and I will have 2, and all the rest of it. So in some sense, we've spent our whole family life navigating the differences between the English language speaking cultures, but also navigating now differences between Western cultures and the culture of Korea, which is quite different, and I think that is incredibly valuable. As I watch the way in which my children have learnt a particular kind of epistemic humility, that is, the capacity not to assume that their way of seeing the world is the only way of seeing the world. Not less to be people of conviction, but people who understand that intelligent, rational, ethical people can arrive at different solutions and different answers to the same question. Does the world look different from the Western Pacific? I think it does in all sorts of ways, not least, for example, in relation to our engagement with China. China is everywhere as the world's second largest economy and accounting for 20-25% of the population of the world. But that is impossible to escape in the Western Pacific, in a way that sometimes in Europe you can feel that people sort of think it's really 1890, and I think that's a real challenge for a country such as the UK, because I think levels of China literacy in this country, in government and in civil society and in business, are not what they ought to be. One of the things we're looking at the university is what we might do to improve the East Asia literacy of people in Britain.
You speak Mandarin, don't you?
I do, and very bad Korean. I have a degree in Korean for which the learning outcome was fluency, and for which in which I did well. But it shows that you can be academically good at something and not necessarily as good practically as you might be. So my Korean is we use it at home, and my Korean is a bit better than my 8-year-old's. So.
One of the newest components of our scholarship programme is Oxford University's Oxford Character Project,
yes,
where we are trying to help our scholars embed some of these character virtues like humility, so that once they reach leadership positions, they already have those things so firmly embedded that moral or ethical slide doesn't happen. And they don't slip into group thinking, or this is the only way to look at solving a particular solution, a problem. Why do you think today, in so many sectors, so many geographies, we continue to see lack of humility, lack of integrity, and just ethical lapses that your 8-year-old would be able to point out very clearly as this is not right?
So I'm not sure that as human beings, I think we're getting worse. I think what is
maybe
happening,
not getting better.
We're not getting better. That might be a bit optimistic. What I think does happen is that increased technologies of communication and increased engagement amplifies the effect of poor behaviour in one way or another.
And accelerates it?
Accelerates it. I also do think that we've been through a period where life became a little more technocratic. If you think about the universities, the universities very strongly had front and centre 100 years ago a notion that they were educating, not merely instructing, in terms of the languages that make that distinction, and that a certain sort of whole person development was important in the life of the university. The University of Sydney is an interesting example. It was very decidedly, when it was established in 1850, a secular institution, in fact barred by statute from having a faculty of theology. But it had a student regulation that if your parents wanted you to, you had to go to church. Go figure, right? And even then, it was gesturing towards the notion that life was more than simply knowing the principles of mathematics or how to be a good electrical engineer, that you had to be asking not only the question how, but also to some extent the question why. And that those bigger questions were appropriately explored during university. I think what happened is that in the mid-20th century, universities withdrew from that broader commitment because there wasn't a huge amount of consensus about what the content of that conversation might look like. And I think people weren't confident that simply equipping students to have the conversation, to explore in that space, was either necessary or possible. So much university teaching became, and many university courses became much more technocratic. And there's a whole literature that sort of traces that process in the development of the university as an institution. At UCL, we're trying, much like the character project, but in different ways, to recover some of that, at least in relation to the issues that I talked about before in relation to disagreement. So we're encouraging students to think about what it means to disagree constructively, what it means to listen to other people, what it means to choose language commensurate with a goal of increasing understanding, what it means to bring to the conversation an orientation that you might be wrong, what it means to show respect for the experience or the professional expertise of somebody else. We've been doing that both with staff and with students, and interestingly also beginning that conversation with the general public, where there's an enormous appetite for it. So our first public engagement in this space, we put a little sign on our website, 700 people turned up. Go figure. Because
wow,
people want to recover in the environment you're talking about, where there's a whole lot more shouting, a whole lot more simplistic assertion of the Twitter truth.
Yeah.
People want to have more nuanced, more richer, more values-informed conversations. Our students want to be a part of that. The public want to be a part of that. And we want to go with them on that journey.
I love that. How do you think the US elections are going to play into that?
It's an interesting question, isn't it? I've just been in the US, and I had a sort of mind-bending day visiting some family in the middle of America, where at breakfast with my son, we had a serving person who gave us probably a 30-minute lecture on politics, delivered in sort of 4 or 5 minute chunks. She'd offer us coffee and give us a lecture. She'd clear away a plate and give us a lecture and whatever. And basically her story was that if a particular candidate was elected to be the president of the US, society would fall apart, things would be, chaos would come again. That same evening, we had dinner with some friends who happened to believe that if the other candidate was elected, society would fall apart, chaos would come again. And what was interesting about those two conversations were not that there were interpretive differences, that they were identifying a similar set of facts in relation to the policies of the candidates or the commitments that they'd made or the things that they'd said, and interpreting them differently, one sort of half full, one half empty, whatever it might be. But they were living in completely parallel universes as regards the basic facts. And that, I think, is a real challenge in a democracy as big as the democracy of the United States. But I think it's something, too, that in the Twitter sphere is something that we increasingly have to guard on. And guard against. And that's why we think the epistemic virtues are so important. Teaching students to stand back and to say, but is that really true? What evidence is there for that as a claim? Encouraging students to intervene when somebody makes an outrageous claim or is unfairly critical of somebody else, and say, yeah, is that fair?
Were you able, with either discussion, to ask any of those questions, or was it just completely the wrong environment to discover a bit more?
So it's a really good question, and I'd love to be able to say that I practiced what I preach and what we preach. What I found myself doing in both situations was gently doing a little bit of prodding, but mostly saying, "Oh, is that so? Uh-huh. Oh, that would be bad. Uh-huh. Because it's just easier, right?
Yeah.
And because having the rhetorical skill and the situation sense to gently challenge, to problematize, to nuance in as many situations as possible, and as you suggest, in some situations it's just not possible. That's a hard skill, and one we've all got to keep working on. Because the default when you want to eat your eggs is just to say, "Oh, that's bad."
Yeah. Poor you.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the things that I'm really struck by is that you do absolutely practice some of the traits that you talk about, and particularly around things like equity and inclusion and diversity. You made a massive difference at the University of Sydney, focused on that. You've made it a key priority again here. And one of the things that cheered me up no end, actually, was when we were chatting after an event and you said, actually, gender equity isn't that complicated. You just have to be intentional about it. Could you share a little bit about how you made so many changes and really embedded a changed culture at the University of Sydney, and what you're doing here too?
Yeah, so I think there are two issues here. One is an issue to do with representation, and then the second is a deeper conversation about diversity and what it looks like for a university and why it's important. On the representation issue, I smile when you talk about gender, because actually I have a gender problem in my direct reports. That is, of my 9 direct reports, 8 are women. And so, but I didn't engineer that, but we've just sent back shortlists. We've kept saying to recruiters, no, this is easy. There are people of talent out there who come in all shapes, sizes and types. We want to see a more diverse shortlist than this. And, I take, for example, our CFO position. We kept being presented a whole lot of, men. We kept sending him out. In the end, we have recruited a South Asian woman who was COO of the whole Home Office for the whole country, who could organise the invasion of France in a morning, and who has revolutionised our capacity to understand and manage our finances. But that took a bit of prodding of the recruiters. So I think on the representation point, it's not that hard. You push the recruiters. You model that at the most senior levels of the institution, and then people involved in recruitment in the organisation get the message that that's really important to the organisation, and hopefully you begin to see broader change. It's not. We've got a way to go at UCL, but I think we can certainly move in that direction. There's a deeper question, though, about what diversity means for a university beyond representation in its statutory form, beyond representation in terms of the protected characteristics under the equalities legislation. And a question as to whether or not if you have a gay Marxist sociologist and a Marxist sociologist of colour and a disabled Marxist sociologist and a woman Marxist sociologist, whether you really have diversity in a sense that is meaningful for an academic department. And that partly then goes to the question of how you disrupt the process of narcissistic self-reproduction, which is so much academic hiring, and try and think about curating your approach to a particular subject, to curating diversity in a particular subject, so that you make sure that when a student is in the department, she encounters a variety of methodologies and probably a variety of viewpoints. And that's tough, right? Because you also want the department to have centres of excellence in particular areas. And if you're a centre of excellence, if you are a centre of excellence in Marxist sociology, then of course the meaningful diversity is going to be to have a gay Marxist sociologist and a Marxist sociologist of colour and whatever, who are bringing their different perspectives to Marxist sociology. But it may be that that's not a big enough scope for the diversity that you need within a particular academic discipline in an institution. And that's why genuine academic leadership is so important, and why the job of heads of department and their teams in a university is so important, and why academic leadership roles in general are so important, because they're not just about approving people's holidays and making sure the light bulbs are fixed. Hopefully they've got nothing to do with making sure the light bulbs are fixed. They ought to be about that kind of careful academic strategy, horizon scanning, thinking about diversity, making sure that we are a place where that meets the aspiration of Ronald Dawkins that the university should be a theatre for the exercise of the independence of the mind, and that a student encounters a variety of ideas rubbing up against one another in that kind of creative friction that is an exciting intellectual community.
Yeah, because you can't have disagreement, can you? And learning about disagreement if everyone's in violent agreement the whole time.
Exactly. And you have to be careful about violent agreement because violent agreement never sees its blind spots.
Yeah. You've obviously met leaders from all over the world. Are there any whom you particularly admire?
Yes. So I think the leader that I have learnt most from was the person who was head of social sciences before I took the role at Oxford, and I worked with him when I was head of the law faculty. And he just had a particular approach to his work that was about putting in place structures and resourcing that set the academic community free to do well what it did well, and was very thoughtful and intentional about that. It really was not about him, to go back to Larry Kramer's way of putting it. And I learned a huge amount from that.
What are other leadership traits that you think our scholars should maybe hold on to?
So, one always is cautious about perspectives that emphasise balance, because in some sense they seem a cop-out. But it is about balance, right? It's about enabling others but also being able to synthesize the perspectives of others and try out a vision in a dialogic process whereby the community can own a direction for the institution. And I say that because often people model top-down leadership or bottom-up leadership as contradictory things, whereas I think the best leadership is both top-down and bottom-up. It's both continually listening and continually saying to the community, well, as I listen to you say all these things, this seems to be the story for the direction of travel, so that the story itself then gets a certain momentum and encourages a particular kind of grassroots activity. And we all know leaders who are a bit of sort of blancmange, don't have any views of their own, and pretend to be enablers. And we all know leaders who are little dictators and pretend to listen, but really are only interested in their vision for the institution. I think the real trick in leadership is this dialogic process between setting and refining and growing a vision for the institution as a whole, but an institution that emerges out of and responds to what's happening across the institution and those things to which the institution is most committed. And for that, you have to do a lot of listening, but you also have to do a lot of asking, because it is a dialogic process. It's not just about feeding back to people what they're already telling you.
You mentioned arriving here in the midst of a pandemic. By many accounts that I've certainly heard, you also inherited a somewhat disenfranchised faculty. Was your dialogical process part of how you turned it around?
So the question makes many assumptions. One is that we've turned it around, and I hope to some extent we have. Yes, I mean I am not in any way saying that my predecessor did not, but I think for whatever reasons, there were at least some faculty in the university who told this narrative of disenfranchisement, and part of what I have tried to do, particularly in the process of writing our 5-year strategy, was to underscore the fact that the strategy was responding to what people told us that they that were really the pain points. So the pain points at UCL are not that we need somebody to set some great academic vision, because the academic work is phenomenal. It's that the buildings are falling down, people are not paid enough, and there are workload issues emerging from not very good university systems and processes. So the strategy we wrote, which is a bit of a boring housekeeping strategy, focuses on the fact that buildings are falling down, that we don't think people are paid enough, and that and on workload emerging from processes. Now, working on those things is tricky, and it involves academic strategy, amongst other things, and it involves change, and the change is difficult and all the rest of it. But if people can remember that what you're trying to do is to address the issues that they have identified as important, I think that goes some way to increasing engagement.
You yourself took a massive pay cut, didn't you, to take on this role? Why? Any regrets?
It's UCL. It's a great. So I had done what I needed to do at Sydney, and was getting to the point at which the job was just too familiar. I knew all the players, I knew the moves they were likely to make, and all the rest of it. And it was clear that, to me at least, that the institution could do with a fresh pair of eyes. The UCL position came up, and who wouldn't want to be in this remarkable job in this remarkable city?
We have a tradition on this leadership lab that the last interviewee asks the next one a question. And actually, Larry's question is, how do you know when to stop, when it's time for you to pass the baton on?
I think you know when to stop. So when you come into one of these roles, you do a lot of listening. You identify those things where you think you can make a contribution, and you set about doing them. Often the job feels a bit like Sisyphus, and you know when you stop, when the rock has got to the top of the hill and you don't think it's going to roll down again. So, for example, when you think you have when you're confident that the university is going to be able to, in this case, maintain systems that will enable it to have decent buildings, to pay people reasonably well, and to and to address issues of workload, or has a capacity which it's not always had to have a management culture that is demonstrably inclusive in the way that it receives input from the university. So there are a number of things, a number of sort of tasks we've set ourselves. Change in a university, it's a sort of 10-year process. So part of it is that at the end of 10 years, you've got to think about whether or not you haven't done enough. But just part of it is that sense of knowing that the rock is not going to roll down the hill in relation to the things that you originally set out to do.
I love that picture. What would you like to ask the next person?
Without knowing who the next person is. I think I would like to understand what it is that gives them joy about their work, what it is that they really like in the process of leading whatever institution it is that they're a part of.
That's fantastic. Michael, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much. It's been a privilege.
Thank you.
Thanks.